Evening, everyone. We are almost at the end of chapter 12 of the Tzemach Tzedek. This is either our last or second to last or third to last class, depending on this mimer, depending on what we do, depending on if we finish the text and immediately move on, or if we want to spend one class as sort of a general summary and general overview. I haven't decided yet. We are close to the end. Chapter 12 is still talking about time. We were speaking last week about how there is a general principle in the Chassidic metaphysics, in the way that God creates the world and the way that God is unified with the world, that as we become more worldly, as we become lower in the process of creation, as we reach lower and lower levels, the revelation, the godly life force, the soul that is invested within anything becomes more and more divided and particular, individuated. The divine soul at the lowest levels, for example, time is our primary subject here. So in time, the divine soul is in a very specific, particular expression. Every moment has a soul, and as the moments pass, each moment has a different soul. But as you go up the hierarchy, as you go up the unfolding creation called Seder Hishtalshelus, the chain-like order of the worlds, in which we go up higher and higher and closer to the source of the worlds in divinity, to the initial spheres of the world of Atzilus, and even beyond to the higher worlds, particularly Akudim, Adam Kadmon, right, to the first world, the highest world we've been speaking about, the expression becomes more and more generalized. So rather than each particular moment having its soul, the souls of every moment are contained in the soul of the hour, and the soul of the hour is contained in the soul of the day, and the soul of the day is contained in the soul of the month, and the soul of the month is contained in the soul of the year, and the soul of the year is contained in the soul of the millennium. And the souls of the various millennia are contained as one expression in the world of Akudim, which is where God sees all of reality at one glance. Right? Everything is seen all at once. So ultimately, this was part of our explanation of how, I'll just repeat the general theme of the chapter, this is part of our explanation of how we really have three categories. We have a God in whom we have faith, who is totally beyond and outside of time, which is near inconceivable, if not totally inconceivable. We have the source of time, Seder HaZman, the order of time, in the spiritual world, generally speaking, from Akudim, from the first expression after the Tzimtzum, Adam Kadmon, the world where everything is gathered together in one glance, until Malchus of Atzilus, the lowest of the spheres of the world of Atzilus, we have the source of time, which time is source. Time as we experience it has its source in the orderly expansion and contraction of the divine revelation, Moti v'lo Moti, Ratzoi v'shuv, in the Tzimtzum and Hispashtus, right? All these different terms. We have the extension and not extension. We have the rushing and returning. We have the contraction, and then the re-emanation of the light, the further emanation of the light. Basically, there is a certain divine rhythm. There is a certain pulse above time, not within time, but in the causality of the successive spiritual emanations, which are the source for time in our reality. And then in the lower spiritual worlds, starting in Yetzirah, in Bria, in Yetzirah, in Asiya, and then to our physical world, we have more and more particular expressions of time. Until actually in our literal physical world, each moment takes place only at its prescribed time with its prescribed soul. The souls are at their most particular expression and most particular level, their most divided expression. Good evening. 3 lines up. We are 3 lines up from the bottom of page 381. We are actually going to speak today, depending on how much we cover, about 2 very interesting things. One has to do with Torah and time, which is kind of a separate subject, but as we'll see, intimately related, that this explanation of how time works time and the order of time and God who is above time explains a certain discrepancy or disagreement of the sages about the Torah. And then finally, as we save the sweetest bit for the end, right? If you learn Gemara, if you learn Talmud, like if you learn a lot of Masechtas, like Daf Yomi, you'll find that the way that Rav Ashi and Ravina, the compilers of the Talmud, arrange the Talmud is that at the end of every Masechta there's something sweet, right? It rarely ends with a dry legal discussion. Usually the end has some sort of a Gadata, some sort of story, a legend, a moral teaching, something like almost like dessert, right? So the dessert of this mimer, the last little paragraph of chapter 12, is about the famous question of human free choice and divine knowledge, which is a perennial classic of Judaism that has fascinated many a mind over the millennia. So we're going to actually take a Chassidic dive into that. We'll see at what level we can muster. We would never claim to answer such a question that the Rambam says is basically unanswerable, more or less. But we'll see what we can do. We'll at least give a fresh perspective, a Hasidic perspective on that issue. So without further ado, let's do the part about Torah and time. 3 lines up on page 381. This is what the sages were talking about when they said, Torah chasuma nitna. It says in Masechtas Gittin, the Torah was given as a sealed entity. The Torah was given sealed. Chasima also means it's like signed. The Torah was undersigned and sealed as a complete package, in other words. And according to one opinion, megala nitna. It was revealed passage by passage. It might actually be Megillah. I'm not sure what the actual word is, but it was given bit by bit. It was revealed slowly, the Torah was revealed. Meaning what? Ki be'emes ha-Torah hi bezmanim chalukim. In truth, the Torah was given at different times, which is really the one opinion in the Talmud that we just said, that the Torah was revealed slowly over time. The Tzemach Tzedek is essentially agreeing with that opinion. As we'll see, really both opinions are right in a way, which is the best possible outcome for a Talmudic discussion. In truth, the Torah was given at different times, meaning what? Parshas Noach nemre bezman ha-mabul. The passage about Noach was said at the time of the Mabul, at the time of the flood. Parshas Avraham achakach, and then the passage concerning Avraham. Chen Parshas Vayishlach Yaakov achakach, and then Yaakov sending his angels to Esav, that happened afterwards. V'achakach Matan Torah, and then the giving of the Torah. V'achakach mitzvah Yom Kippurim v'chayotze, and then the mitzvah of Yom Kippur. In other words, these these passages were revealed within time. In other words, the Torah was not given all at once. The Torah was not given as a package. The Torah was actually revealed over time. The Torah was a successive revelation. Right? In other words, there was a certain revelation of the Parashas of Noach, which was actually attached to the Mabul. The Torah regarding the flood that happened in the time of Noach corresponded and was revealed at the time of the Mabul. In other words, the fact that God's intellect was invested into a certain passage of what came to be the Torah really happened concurrent with the time that the events it was describing occurred, right? And to preface, there's a general issue, in other words, with the Torah, right? It's the whole matter. We know that the Torah came from Moshe in the desert, right? And it came from the Jews in the desert. And Moshe was taught the Torah in prophecy from God, and then he taught the Torah to the people. And there was a written Torah and an oral Torah. It's somewhat mysterious, however, how the actual text as we have it came to be put together, right? Because interestingly, the Torah describes the process of its own giving to Moshe and the process to a large extent of its own revelation to the people, right? We know Sefer Dvarim was said at the end of the 40 years in the desert, right before the Jews went into the land of Israel, right? There's various stories which occur, right? So the whole question becomes, so who is actually Who is speaking in the Torah, right? What voice is the Torah spoken in? These are all questions raised in the commentators, right? Who is the narrator of the Torah, which sometimes seems to shift? Who is speaking? Because even God is spoken about in the third person in the Torah, right? It says, God said to Moses saying, not I said to Moses saying, right? So the Torah is spoken in the third person, which is also very interesting, right? So all these things are spoken about in the commentaries. And you have Sefer Bereshis, which to Moshe would have been legends from thousands of years ago until only centuries before, right? You have Sefer Shmos, which describes events that occurred in Moshe's lifetime, right? Then you have the very end of the Torah, which describes Moshe's death. So the whole thing becomes a question of, so how was this given? Did God tell Moshe what to write about the past? Did he tell him what to write about the future in advance? Right? In other words, was Moshe given the whole Torah perhaps at Mount Sinai, and then it was the future was written? That would be very strange. And then he didn't tell the people, right? Or did he write it as that what happened in the desert occurred and as it went along? Right, because much of what Moshe writes is about himself, and not always in the most positive light either necessarily. Right, Moshe writes about his own mistakes, and in general, it's very interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about. There's many opinions, there's many commentaries. It's a whole area of Torah study is the construction of the Torah. So part of that discussion is this disagreement in the Gemara, where there's the one opinion says, the sages say, that the Torah was given as a sealed entity. In other words, the Torah, you can't, this corresponding, if you think about it, to a very abstract notion of the Torah, right? In other words, if lahavdil, you were to take, I don't know, the Encyclopedia Britannica, that's a very old example, I don't know, the Oxford English Dictionary, if that's still around, and you were to remove one line at random, right? It wouldn't really damage the overall book very much, right? Depending on the line, of course, but generally speaking, it wouldn't damage the overall book very much. The Torah, because it is godly, right, the Rambam writes that anyone who changes a single letter of the Torah or doubts that a single letter was given to Moses through prophecy, right, is essentially a heretic regarding the Torah as a whole. It doesn't come in parts, right? Something which comes from God doesn't come in parts. If the whole thing is godly, if the whole thing is a godly expression, you don't get to choose this verse I like, this verse I don't like. It's not how it works, right? If it comes from God, you take the whole thing and you don't dare change a letter. Right? This is a written Torah it's referring to. The oral Torah, interestingly, is different. Right? The oral Torah is fundamentally a different type of thing because the oral Torah is Torah that's given over to man's reason. So it's a whole different ballgame. Right? But the written Torah, the actual chumash, the words of the text, right, are not to be changed. God forbid to change a single letter. Right?
But the first written version of the Torah was a long time afterwards, wasn't it?
No. The Torah was given to Moses in the desert.
So what was the oldest scroll?
The oldest scroll that we have found? Yes. I don't know. Maybe the Dead Sea Scrolls? I'm not sure. I don't know if the oldest found scroll is. But every Sefer Torah that we have today was copied from an earlier Sefer Torah, as the rules go. So
there's the progression of how things were peeled back.
So the question is, if Moshe Rabbeinu, if Moses was viewing the Torah as we view the Torah, which is that the Torah is united all as one entity, and not if Moses viewed it, pardon me, that was a weird start to the sentence. If we are looking at the Torah as all united, as one entity, not a single letter can be missing, it is logical to think, right, I'm ascribing a potential reason to what the sages said, right, so take it with a grain of salt. But it is logical to think that the Torah would all be given at once, right? The Torah, in other words, the Torah is given chasuma. The Torah is given signed and sealed. It's a complete entity, because really, as a godly entity, and if you learn about the nature of Torah as a limited work which contains the infinite knowledge of God, right, which is what it is according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, then the Torah essentially is completely, what's the term? The Torah is completely interdependent, right? Every letter depends on every other letter, right? It's a complete work. And so the Torah must have been given completely, right? It says one opinion in the Talmud that the Torah was given passage by passage, that the Parshas Noach was revealed at one time, then the Parsha for Avram was revealed at a different time, the Parsha of Matan Torah, the section for the giving of the Torah, was revealed at a different time, the Parsha of Yom Kippur was revealed at a different time, right? So the question is can these two views be resolved, right, in the Talmud. And the Tzemach Tzedek is saying, the Rebbe is saying, that according to our understanding of time, how there is a God who is above time, there is a source of time in the spiritual realms, and there is an actual time from which comes from the source of time. According to this understanding, we can actually understand this Gemara. Right? Says the Tzemach Tzedek, we are 3 lines up on page 380. Ela shazeu kafi shaba begilui. Rather, says that, so the Tzemach Tzedek sides with the opinion which says the Torah was revealed one thing at a time. However, with a big caveat, right? He qualifies the statement. The Tzemach Tzedek says, the sage who says the Torah was revealed one passage at a time is correct. However, Ela shazeu kafi shaba begilui. This is how the Torah came in a revealed way. As the verse says, and God said to Moshe, Mibechinas dibur elyon, referring to the divine speech, shemisgale bebiyah, which was revealed in the lower worlds of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, kafi hazman shalahem, according to their time. Right? Which, as we have said, as we've mentioned earlier already in this chapter, the lower 3 spiritual worlds also have actual time, but their actual time is much more condensed, right? Such that you have 15 years in a very short amount of time in the world of Yetzirah, I believe, was our example, right? So, what we are essentially saying is that there's really 2 different aspects to Torah, which is why you have a disagreement among the sages, because the sages are not really arguing. The sages are talking about 2 different aspects of the Torah. The sage that was saying that the Torah was revealed one part at a time is really talking about how the Torah was revealed in the lower worlds. In other words, let us go back and preface. What is Torah according to Chassidus, right? It's a deceptively simple question. What is Torah? Right? Torah is a book, right? Torah is a whole library worth of books. I'm giving you different definitions. Torah is a way of life, right? Torah is a directive for man's practical action. Torah is a philosophy. There's different ways you could explain what Torah is. Chassidus says that Torah is the wisdom of God. That's what Torah is. Torah is the divine wisdom. It's the Chachma Elyona. It's the supernal wisdom. Torah is God's wisdom. Now, why would God's wisdom be expressed in a way that we can understand it in any way? And the answer is that was God's will. God took His wisdom, which is truly infinite and doesn't come in letters and doesn't come in words, right? And He took His wisdom and He brought it down into the world, and He essentially instantiated it within the world, right? To different extents. For example, what do I mean by to different extents? As I said before, the written Torah, the actual scroll of the Torah, is treated, according to halacha, as an actual metzias of Torah. In other words, if I ask you, what is the Torah? Point to the object. You would point to the Torah scroll, right? The Torah scroll is the Torah. The Torah scroll is a representation of God's wisdom in the world. It is God's wisdom actually instantiated in the world. And it is so holy that Jewish law treats it as such, right? We don't treat the Torah lightly. We don't behave around the Torah the same way we behave normally, right? We would never, God forbid, disrespect the Torah, put the Torah on the ground. There's a whole protocol for reading the Torah, for unwrapping the Torah, for wrapping the Torah, taking the Torah out, putting the Torah back in. We stand when the Torah enters the room, right? So let us say that the Sefer Torah, the actual book of the Torah, is the least worldly of the Torah's expressions within the world. There are, however, other expressions of the Torah in the world. For example, you have the Mishnah or the Talmud, right, which are works of the oral Torah, which was really never meant to, quote unquote, be written down, right, which was really meant to remain an oral tradition. But nevertheless, you have the Mishnah and you have the Talmud. The Mishnah and the Talmud are works that are given over to human wisdom. As such, the Mishnah and the Talmud, first of all, Where do we see this in Jewish law? In Jewish law, if a person reads words from the written Torah, from the Tanakh or from the Chumash, right? If you go up for an aliyah and you read your words from the Torah scroll that you have your aliyah for, you are fulfilling the mitzvah of learning Torah if you do not understand the words at all. Why? Why do you not need to understand them? Because those words are essentially Torah. Right? In other words, those you are saying words of Torah, whether those words impact you at a level of your mind or not, because the actual words of the Chumash are holy and divine and come from God and cannot be changed. However, in Jewish law, if you learn a Mishnah or you learn a page of Gemara and you just read it, and you don't understand it at all, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of learning Torah. This is according to Jewish law. You have not fulfilled your obligation to learn Torah if you do not understand the Mishnah or the Talmud, because the Mishnah and the Talmud, the oral law, are given over to human understanding. The entire point of them is that they are meant for us to grasp them intellectually. So you could say that the Mishnah and the Gemara, though absolutely holy and holy works, and God forbid we would never put them on the floor or disrespect them or anything like that, the Mishnah and the Talmud are not at the same level. They are not at the same, they don't have, the way I would put it is they do not have the same sacred, we don't treat them with the same sacred relationship that we treat the Torah scroll, which is obvious. The Torah scroll is not an item of everyday life in Judaism. The Torah scroll is something special. It's holy, it's sacred, it's removed from everyday life, it's to only be accessed in a very specific way and with a very specific purpose, the actual Torah scroll. As opposed to the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are essentially, even though they are holy, they are objects more within our grasp. They are objects of everyday life. A Jew should learn Mishnah everywhere, take a Mishnah with him everywhere, right? The rules are much more lax for where you're allowed to learn Mishnah as opposed to where you're allowed to take a Torah scroll. It's all sorts of things. So, why am I bringing all this up? I'm bringing all this up because we see that there are different aspects of the Torah which are drawn into the world at different extents. So you can consider it a spectrum. At the highest end of the spectrum, you have that which is barely worldly at all, like a Sefer Torah, which is, according to Jewish law, is not treated as a worldly object essentially in any way. The Torah is treated as a godly object that happens to be in our world. And on down through lower instantiations of the Torah, more worldly, more grasped by human intellect, more united with the world. And each one has their purpose and their place and is part of Torah. And the reason why it's done this way is not for now, but God essentially reveals different aspects of the Torah into the world to unite himself with the world in different ways. And let's leave it at that. So there's different levels of that expression. So too, we are saying in our mimer that the way that the Torah was revealed in time reflects the same spectrum. There's different aspects of the Torah. There is an aspect of the Torah which is more worldly, which exists within time. And there is an aspect of the Torah which is more godly, which naturally exists more beyond time. This explains the opinion of the two sages in the Talmud that the Torah was given all at once, and the Torah was given over time. So it says, the Tzemach Tzedek has said that the opinion which says that the Torah was given over time is the correct opinion if you were actually there and looking at the physical events in the world. God revealed the Torah over time to Moshe Rabbeinu, who then revealed it to the children of Israel.
So you're describing how grammatically how many of the parshas are written, because they're not prophecies, they're explanations of what is taking place. They're instructions, for example.
Yes, or descriptions of past events or present events, right, as depending, right?
Because otherwise it doesn't make the average human being.
Right, unless it's prophecy. Yeah, we were talking about that, I think, as you came in, maybe. Yeah, you're right, exactly. So there's whole questions of whether it was prophecies for the future or descriptions of the past, or was the Torah said at the present. So we're saying that according to this opinion, the Torah was said was revealed within time. However, this is the Torah as it descends into the worlds where time is of the essence, where time exists, right? Where the worlds are ruled by time. So in other words, if you are describing the process whereby the Torah was given by God to man in a world in which time exists, right? And Moshe was a very special man who had prophecy to very lofty and extreme heights. So he didn't just exist in this world; he existed in the spiritual worlds as well, certainly the lower ones. So as the Torah was revealed to Moses and then to the children of Israel, the Torah was revealed within time. Right? It wasn't given all at once. It was given parsha by parsha, piece by piece over time. Aval, we are on the third line of 383. Aval b'sheresh haTorah ba'ak. However, in the source of the Torah, in Adam Kadmon, in the world of Akudim, where all the spheros are united as one, which we've been speaking about for 2 chapters now. If you recall, we said in the previous chapter that this is the Torah that God reads in order to create the world, right? He said, God read, let there be light, and then he said in the Torah, and then he said, let there be light, and created the world, right? Which was describing the source of the Torah in the world of Adam Kadmon, the Torah in its primordial state, where the Torah exists as one expression of God, and the creation of the world was essentially unfolding the individual, the implicit individual creations within Torah. So in other words, everything existed, all united in the world of Adam Kadmon, which is the source of Torah, the highest level, so to speak, of Torah, and God looked in the Torah and saw that the Torah said, let there be light. In other words, and he said, let there be light. He took the reality of light and the sphera associated with light, his expression associated with light, and he unfolded it from that unity. He took it out of that unity in which it was implicit, and he made it explicit into an actual creation, which is a summary of what we talked about last chapter. So that at that level of the Torah in its primordial state, as the Torah exists in the source of time, right? Bichlal hakodum, in the primordial generality, that's how I would translate that. In the primordial generality, the original general emanation, which contained everything that was, is, and will be in all the spiritual worlds, higher and lower, the Torah in that reality, kelelas kulam ka'achas, everything is included there at once. So in other words, the question of whether the Torah exists in time and outside or above time all at once is both, obviously. The Torah as it is brought into the world exists within time. The Torah as it exists as one above the passage of time, obviously it's all at once, right? The same way that God sees everything that is to happen in history, past, present, and future, at a glance, in the world of Adam Kadmon, and that at that very high revelation, so too the Torah at that level is also above time. The Torah being the source of the world, so it's obvious logically the Torah is also above that division, and therefore the Torah as it exists in Adam Kadmon always existed all at once. In other words, to put it slightly differently, right? The events. This is actually directly related to the next subject in the Maimar, so it's a good thing to get it right. In other words, in the physical world, first there was a Noah's flood, then there was an Abraham and Isaac and a Jacob, and then there was the giving of the Torah, for example, right? The Torah, as it comes into the world, was given in order. First there was a Torah about Noah, then there was a Torah about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then there was a Torah about the giving of the Torah, right? However that worked, whatever, set that aside for a moment. However, in the source of things, the actual progression of the events in time has a source. The progression of the events in time itself has a source in a higher spiritual reality in which everything happens at once. Past, present, and future all exist together. And that reality is Adam Kadmon. In Adam Kadmon, the events, not the Torah, right? The events of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the giving of the Torah, and our learning this class tonight, right, all exist at the same time, right? Because there is no division of time there. They exist as part of one unity, and that one unity contains everything, right? Therefore, it is only logical that the Torah, which is the source of the world in which these events will happen in time, the Torah, which is the source of that world, is also completely unified. So in other words, it becomes a question of which came first, right? So there's really, you could say 4 stages if you want. You could divide it different ways. But you could say there's 4 stages, right? There's 4 stages. The first thing that happens is there's a Torah which contains everything that will be in the universe. Everything that will take place, past, present, and future, is contained implicitly in a spiritual reality of the Torah. Not the Torah as a text as we have it in this world, but as it is literally the wisdom of God in one unity. Right? It is simply one expression, and that one expression implicitly contains everything in all the universes, all the world, spiritual and physical, through all of history, all of time and space. Then there is the actual implicit, there is the actual creation of the implicit things that are within the story. So first, you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the world of Adam Kadmon as they exist implicitly. And you have a Noah's flood, and you have a giving of the Torah, right? And you have a war with Sichon and Og, and you have the Jewish people entering the land of Israel, right? And you have a 6-day war and a Spanish Inquisition and all sorts of interesting things, right? That's all in the Torah first. In other words, to God it makes no difference. It doesn't. There's no historical causality at first, right? Everything exists to God from His perspective, looking at Adam Kadmon in one glance. Everything is all laid out. That's in the source. Then the actual events are created to play out in time. They are unfolded according to their soul, according to their spiritual quality. They are unfolded in time as we have been speaking about in this chapter, right? They go through a successive order of the worlds and are divided into smaller and smaller godly emanations, which eventually actually unfold as a moment-to-moment time as we experience it in our physical world, right? So you have the source of the actual events in Torah. You have the actual events as they take place, and then you have the worldly Torah which unfolds in time describing those events, right? So if you ask the question, does the flood of Noah precede the story, the parsha about Noah, or does it proceed from the parsha of Noah? And the answer is both. It depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about the Torah as it's revealed in time, the Torah is describing an event that has already unfolded, that has already taken place, right? Or is taking place at the time the Torah is given, depending on how you want to interpret this Gemara, I suppose. Or you could look at it from a higher perspective and say that on the contrary, the actual event unfolds from the one Torah which is given chasuma, which is given signed and sealed, all as a unity in its original expression. So that is what the sages of the Talmud are arguing about. The sages of the Talmud are arguing about, when we talk about how the Torah is given, are we talking about how it is given in the world as it proceeds from physical events? Or are we talking about it as it is in God's wisdom as it precedes physical events? You have both perspectives. You have both things. And really, the true miracle is that the two Torahs are one Torah. That's really the bottom. That's the bottom line. That's the takeaway. The takeaway is that the Torah, the actual Torah as it is instantiated within letters, that you can actually read in a scroll, that Torah is a vessel for the divine wisdom of God, which is the source of the events that are being described in God's own wisdom. And the two things are one, which, if you think about it, is really one of the greater miracles. It's in a way, it's even greater than the splitting of the sea or any of the things described in the Chumash, is the Torah itself. That God's wisdom, which precedes creation, should actually be expressed in this work, which is apparently limited, at least on its surface, right? As we just said before, it is a muat hamachzikas hameruba. It is a small thing which holds a big thing, right? It's bigger on the inside. The Torah is bigger on the inside, right?
There's a difference between knowing the future, and not being surprised by the future.
Okay.
So, if you say, well, God knows what I'm about to say, or what you're about to say, everybody does.
Yes.
And, so if he knows all that, then he's just sort of a spectator watching, sitting in the audience.
It's interesting you say that. We'll get to that in a minute. That's actually in our mimer. We'll talk about that in a moment.
Questions,
Yeah? On that topic? Okay, we'll talk about it in a minute.
But as opposed to if something happens and you say, well, I thought about it happening exactly that way,
Right.
but I'm not surprised by it. There's no
Right.
bell or whistle that goes off.
Right. But the thing is that God's foreknowledge is actually for experience. It's not just foreknowledge, right? When a person knows something in advance, as a rule, unless they're a prophet or something else strange, right? When a person predicts the future, right? Here's never mind. I can't give all my thoughts on this topic. But the short version is, when a person predicts the future, generally speaking, they are not really predicting the future in a way of prophecy, right? As the general rule is that the non-prophets among us, when we are able to, when the non-prophets of the 409Cs, the non-prophets among us can predict the future, we predict it based on an understanding of the present. We're not really prophets, we're really sages, right? Implicit in the present, right? Ezehu achacham, says the Mishnah. Who is wise? Hareya es hanoila, the one who sees things as they are born, right? Well, one interpretation is seeing things as they are born means you can see the future predicted in the present. You don't just look at what's in front of your face. You look at what does the present mean for what will be, right? That's wisdom. You see, meaning in other words, what is it really? It's a deeper experience of the present. It's not an experience of the future. It's a deeper experience of the present. From a deep experience of the present, you'll be able to predict the future to some extent, right? Even though the Rebbe explicitly writes, as an aside, that the deterministic, mechanistic notion of determinism, of I believe his name was Laplace, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, a French physicist of the Enlightenment, who said that if he knew the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, he could predict everything that would happen until the end of time. The Rebbe was emphatically against such a position. I believe the Rebbe says explicitly that such a position has no room in Torah whatsoever. The doctrine of miracles alone would uproot that position, according to the Rebbe. So it's not like, in other words, it's not that a person who's wise and looks into the present is able to predict everything that happens in the future necessarily, right? But miracles notwithstanding, unusual circumstance notwithstanding, and obviously he's only able to predict a narrow range of things in very controlled circumstances, but a person can look into the present and judge as best they can what will happen in the future. And there are people who use this ability in very limited circumstances, in very limited fields such as business or the stock market, to become very wealthy, right? They invest correctly. Many times they become very successful. Of course, if you ask them, who's going to win the World Series 3 years from now, that's impossible to answer, right? So it's a very limited range and a very limited scope. When we say God sees the future, it's really a bigger issue, because God doesn't see the future as a human sees the future from the present. God experiences the future directly, right, all at once. God experiences it because it has happened already, right, in his eyes. He stands outside the flow of time. But we'll get to, there's going to be a bit on choice and God's knowledge in a minute, and we'll discuss that more. Let's finish this part about the Torah, and then if we have time, we'll start that next thing. We're 3 lines up on page 383. V'liyas, being. Ki nesbar le'el, that we explained before. Shagam ha'klal ha'kadum anal, that even this primordial generality in which the Torah exists in its highest form, hu netzal la'acharat tzimtzum, is emanated after the divine tzimtzum, the divine contraction. We'll talk about that more in a second. Ma'achar she'en bichlal ela masha bifrat, because the general... there's a rule that the general category does not contain except what is in the particulars. Aval atzmusa yisborech lav mekol inain midas iu klal. He himself, may he be blessed, is not of any of these attributes at all. L'chein hu l'mayla me'azman legamre, and therefore he is above time entirely. The Tzemach Tzedek is noting as follows, that we must not mistake the Torah as we are describing it. The truth is that I was dishonest with you. The Torah as we are describing it, as I described as the highest level of Torah, is not the highest level of Torah. What we are describing, the Torah as the blueprint for the worlds, as the Torah in one godly expression of divine wisdom, contains within it everything that will happen in all the universe and all the spiritual worlds, past, present, and future, and all of space. Right? This is a description of the Torah, it says, the Tzemach Tzedek, that we must always remember is an after the Tzimtzum expression of Torah. This is an after the Tzimtzum godly expression. What does that mean? We've spoken about the Tzimtzum before, but let's review again. It's important. Right? In the beginning there is God and His light alone, right? And He moves His light to the side, which we even spoke about what that meant at one point. In an act that is called the Tzimtzum Harishain, the original Tzimtzum. Some argue, I believe, that this is the Arizal's primary contribution to Kabbalah, I believe, is his understanding, his doctrine of the Tzimtzum Harishain, the original contraction, the original removal of the light. There's a lot that can be said about the Tzimtzum, but the basic idea, the basic thing for us right now is that the Tzimtzum is what allows there to be something that exists outside of God in any way at any level, right? Without the Tzimtzum, if there is just God and His light alone, you have God Himself, and you have the expression of all that God is, and there is no room, conceptually speaking, for anything else to exist. Nothing else has any potential for existence. Nothing else is implicitly going to exist in any way, because you just have God and the fullness of His being, the expression of all that He is, in a single expression. In other words, in the complete expression, the complete whole holistic expression of what He is. Let's put it that way. So there is no room for anything to exist. How can anything else exist? There's just God, and so to speak, the experience of what God is, or God's experience of Himself. There's different ways you could look at it that way, but that's all that exists. God creates a tzimtzum. Essentially, He removes His being conceptually, in a spiritual sense. He removes Himself, that something other than Him may arise, right? And that leaves an empty space. Into the empty space, He sends a single ray of the original light called the Kav. The first revelation of the Kav is Adam Kadmon, is this level of the Torah that we're describing. So in other words, what we are essentially saying is that God Himself is cut off. Between God Himself and this initial expression of the Torah that we are describing as so lofty and so high as to contain everything that we have ever known in its source in an implicit way, this expression is cut off from the reality of God by the Tzimtzum. This expression is not the expression of all that God is, but is rather in a very refined sense, not in a technical sense, because when you get into the technical definition of the word creation, it has a technical definition which may not apply. But in a very general sense, it is a creation of God. In other words, it is not God Himself, nor an expression of all that He is, but rather it is something that was created or emanated in a specific part of a process that He has already started by removing Himself from where it is taking place, right? In other words, this is not synonymous with God. This is something that God is creating in a space that He has specifically removed Himself from so that it can take place, right? Why is this important? Because, as he quoted from what we read in the introduction to Tikkun Ezer from Pasuk Eliyahu, what we read on Friday afternoon, Lav mikol inayin midas iu klal. He Himself is not among any of these traits. In other words, as infinite and as high and as unified and as lofty as this expression of Torah is, it is really the beginning of the source of time. God Himself is totally beyond time, and He is totally beyond this expression of Torah. He is totally beyond the world of Akudim, this world that we are describing. He Himself is infinitely removed, infinitely beyond this reality that we are describing, which is really only the first post-Tzimtzum reality, the first reality after He removes Himself and then begins to create. So we
become independent.
Independent, yeah. The truth is that if you were to look at Adam Kadmon, you wouldn't see how it was independent at all. In fact, you would see how you would think that it was God himself. In fact, I had a mashpia in yeshiva who used to say that if we could see clearly the lowest sphera of the lowest of the four worlds, we would think it was God himself, right? Because, in other words, the extent to which it is actually unified with God is probably beyond our wildest imaginings. But nevertheless, we are told, we have a doctrine of the Tzimtzum, we learn, wisdom-wise, we are taught that this is not God himself. And do not mistake it for God himself. For God himself is totally beyond even the source of time.
But he can always put himself back there if he wants to.
Depends what you mean. God can always do anything if he wants to. The question is, does he want to, right? The second line of page 382. The Iker, and he is so fundamentally removed from this world of Adam Kadmon, from the world of Akudim, ad shagam skira achas lo yitachin leimar, to the extent that you are not even able to say that he sees everything at one glance. In other words, this description that everything in the universe, everything that takes place in all the spiritual worlds and the physical world, past, present, and future, and all of space all at once, this you cannot ascribe to God at all. God is totally beyond that description, right? So we should realize that another takeaway from this chapter is that when we talk of God, we talk about something much more than the sum total of everything in all the worlds, right? Something much more, something infinitely removed from that.
Keep going.
The kol shekain seder hazman shebemidas da'atzilus, and all the more so, a kal v'chemer, if he is beyond even the highest source of time, where everything exists all at one glance, surely he is beyond the actual order of time as it proceeds in the traits, in the midas of atzilus, in the spheres, right, where each sphera corresponds to millennium. He is certainly beyond that source of time. Ella, rather, he only contracts his light. He limits his expression so that it can be all of the universe and everything within it in one glance, right? That is a limitation of his light. To include within it everything that exists in all of time as one. So in other words, the Tzemach Tzedek finishes that little section by saying, do not mistake this Torah that we speak of as the source of everything with God himself. This too is an expression. This too is a certain expression of the Torah. And the truth is that if you learn Maimarim, you find out that the Torah itself extends even higher. The Torah has roots in Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, and so on and so forth. There's more to talk about, but this highest Torah that we're talking about is really, here's a different way of putting it, from the perspective of the universe, looking for its source, this is the highest Torah. In other words, the highest thing that can be said to be the source of the universe, of everything that it is implicit in this world of Adam Kadmon. But if you're looking at it from above, if you're looking at it from an objective perspective of God who creates the Torah, this itself is just an emanation after the Tzimtzum. It's just a limitation of his light. So really, it depends who you're asking. It depends who you're asking whether this is the highest level of Torah or not. Are you asking God from the perspective that he is creating the limited realities, or are you asking God as he is beyond these things, right? Because the truth is, as we've spoken about before, that it's not just the perspective of the universe which is below this world, but God himself lowers his own perspective down to the world of Atzilus, right? Which is directly connected to the next thing we're going to learn in this discourse. That, as we said before, as we mentioned previously in this class, there is a rule. The rule says, there's a verse, which says, Kel Deus Havaya. He is a God of opinions, is actually a literal translation. He is a God of knowledges, plural. What does that mean? It's explained in Chassidus that generally speaking, there are two godly perspectives on reality. Not a perspective of God in the creation. God himself, which has really been implicit in pretty much every chapter of this discourse, by the way. God himself is of two minds. God himself is of two minds on things. He has two perspectives. God has a perspective from above limited reality, which is called Das Elyon, the higher perspective. From the higher perspective, none of this really exists at all. In the higher perspective, the world was never really created. The whole thing, all there is an expression of his Or Ein Sof. In fact, just as it was before the Tzimtzum. From God's perspective, and there are many Maimarim dedicated to explaining how this is, from God's perspective, all there is Or Ein Sof as there was before the Tzimtzum. In other words, the whole act of creation, which begins with his own self-limitation and all of these things, was something that Bichlal never happened. It was something that never really took place. All there really is an expression of the Or Ein Sof from the higher perspective.
A figment of his imagination.
Even less than a figment of an imagination. A figment of an imagination, you could at least say happened, right? There's I have a figment in my imagination, right? About this, you wouldn't even say that he has a figment in his imagination. From that perspective, from that godly perspective, right? And in that godly perspective is what we say that we say various things about it. We say leis machshavet tzvisa beklal, no thought can grasp him. We say lav mikol inon midos iu klal. He is not from any of these traits that are ascribed to him. He is not defined by any of these traits we ascribe to him. In general, God is beyond, above and beyond, and the whole thing is just an expression of his infinite Or Ein Sof. It's as if it never happened, from one perspective. There's a different perspective in Chassidus, and really understanding that there's both perspectives is the key to solving a lot of thorny issues. Essentially, this answers a lot of theological questions are explained by this. There's another perspective which is called Das Tachton, in which he lowers himself down to create the world. In other words, the world is actually something that he is involved in. The world is something that, so to speak, affects him, something of which he is actively aware, right? And all of these various things. And the truth is that we've already had this in our Maimer several times, right? For example, when we discuss God's knowledge of the world, right, we essentially came to the understanding that it depends what you're talking about, right? There's a godly knowledge of the world in his in his light, as we described it, which the light is totally infinite, and he knows everything only by knowing himself, as the Rambam would have said, right? I'm dredging up ancient history here. And in the vessels, however, in the limited godly expression that we were talking about back in chapter 4 or 5 a long time ago, right? In the limited godly expression, right, he knows everything with a knowledge outside of himself. He actually knows it. There is actually something such as God's knowledge, right? And God's knowledge is affected by things that happen in the world, right? That was the lower perspective. And which one is right? The answer is they're both right. You can't have a sphera without light and vessel. You need both, right? Both things go into it, right? You have Das Elyon and you have Das Tachten. You have the higher perspective, the perspective that is above creation, and you have the perspective that is within the creation. Really, this explains, as you will see if you read the Maimarim of the Alter Rebbe, this explains all sorts of interesting things, right? Including the fascinating topic, which we will now only get to do 5 minutes of, and we'll finish next week, God willing. The topic of free will and God's foreknowledge, which Spencer has already brought up tonight. This is just the last little paragraph at the end of the Maimer, right? It's like 10 lines max. The last line on page 382. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, Umizeh muvan ma'at mizeir. From this we will understand a little bit, inyan hayediyah u'bechira, about the idea of what is called Yediyah and Bechira, which means God's knowledge and human free choice. If I do the preface, we're not going to learn any more of the Maimer, but we should do the preface, and I'll repeat it next week as well, because next week you'll need the review. I apologize. Sorry, I know.
Don't we have extra time tonight?
It'll be
there extra time when we open now?
It'll be recorded.
When it's a tie.
Huh?
Only when it's a tie, there's extra time.
It'll be recorded as usual, God willing, and eventually all put up on the YouTube channel. Eventually, Well, we're waiting to the end of the Maimer, then we'll have the whole Maimer up. That'll be exciting. And you can go. We could do a watching marathon, right? Yeah. There's going to be something like 60 or 65 classes, something like that, God willing. All right, let's do the preface. The preface is like this: the Rambam in Mishnah Torah, the Rambam in his famous book on Halacha, happens to write about the idea of choice and foreknowledge, which is interesting because the Rambam's book is generally not philosophical. The Rambam is writing a book of Jewish law, and there's not a lot of philosophy in it. There's only the philosophy which pertains directly to Jewish law, which raises the question every time he says something philosophical, why is this here, right? Of which there are many commentaries through the ages, and the Rebbe has many talks himself about these various questions. Why are these different things here? What do they teach us about practical keeping of halacha? But in any case, the Rambam, one of the philosophical things that is packed into Mishnah Torah, it actually has a lot of philosophy in it. It's just packed in a very dense way and sprinkled throughout the Sefer. So one of the things he speaks about is the idea that God knows perfectly everything that will happen in the future, and yet man has free will to choose. And the Rambam goes on a long spiel, which is very uncharacteristic for Mishnah Torah, which is very terse, very concise. Every letter is conserved as a rule. The Rambam was very organized, wrote very clearly, and all of a sudden there's this long sort of, almost, I wouldn't say a tirade, that would be disrespectful, but sort of a long sort of discourse. He starts talking about the idea of choice and free will. And he essentially says that the answer to this question is very important. It's a very lofty idea. Many mountains hang off this idea. In other words, this is a fundamental and very important idea that we have free choice, and yet God knows everything in advance as well at the same time. And this is incredibly important to Judaism. And yet, we really cannot grasp the depths of it. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to understand. And the Rambam essentially leaves it off on, we can't understand. I'm not going to write about it. I'm not going to explain it. Comments the Raavad. The Raavad is the famous commentator. He's the opposition. He's like the like in Parliament, they have Her Majesty's loyal opposition. So the Raavad is His Majesty's loyal opposition, right? Every time the Rambam says something, not every time, but often when the Rambam says something, the Raavad disagrees, right? The Raavad is like the commentary that you go, says the Raavad, the exact opposite every time, right? So that's the famous joke about why does the Rosh Hashiva believe that God exists? Because the Rambam says so and the Raavad doesn't argue, right? That's the famous joke. So the Raavad on this says, what is the Rambam doing, right? If you don't have an answer to a question, don't bring the question up in the first place. And if you have an answer, say the answer, right? Although the Rambam brings up this whole issue, and he says it's very important, and then he doesn't explain it. Right? That's what so the Raavad asks, and the Rebbe has a whole sikha about this. The Raavad asks, what in the world is going on here? The Rambam brings up the issue, and then he has a whole speech about how he can't explain it to us. The one or the other. Either don't bring it up or give us the answer, right? That's one interesting interaction. There's a second interesting interaction, because there's a famous rabbi called Rav Alma Shnino, who I believe was a Rishon as well. Couldn't have lived much longer after the Rambam, maybe even lived before the Rambam. I'm not positive on the historical nature. And he gives the famous Jewish answer, at least at the simple level, which is no secret, to this question of foreknowledge and free choice. And the answer is very simple. God exists outside of time. Right? God exists outside of time. So when we say that He knows what you're going to do in advance, just like if you have a human fortune teller who somehow learns the future, the person who knows the future does not cause what is going to happen. Just because I know what is going to happen does not mean that I make it so. Right? And the exact same thing is true of God. This is the simple explanation. The simple explanation is that, what do you mean? How can God know and we have free choice? The answer is, He knows and He doesn't tell us. He doesn't make it happen. Right? He simply knows what's going to happen. So what's the question, right? You have an absolutely free choice. He happens to know what is going to happen, not because He makes you do it, because he has already seen it, right? In other words, it's the same question it's like saying, I know that what?
He watched the movie.
Yeah, like there's a difference between knowing what happens if there's an inflection point and knowing which inflection point is going to occur.
No, Rav Amoshnino is saying like this. He's saying the same way that I know that the Braves lost the series against the Padres, God knows what you're going to do 3 weeks from now, right? It just happens to be that I'm limited to knowing things that have already happened. He happens to be unlimited. He knows things that are going to happen also. From his perspective, things that are going to happen are things that have already happened as well. So what's the contradiction? Yeah.
But these events can't exist up in the higher world. I can't remember which one it was.
We're not talking about higher world. Rav Mashnino is just talking about God. He's not talking about worlds. I'm telling you what Rav Mashnino says.
Is it right to say then God knows what free choice decisions you're going to make?
Yes, that's exactly what he's saying. That's what he's saying. He's saying that God, from his vantage point, outside of time, to him everything has already occurred. So your free choice that you are going to make, to him is something that you have already done. Very simple. Right? To him, it's simply something that you have already done. And just as anyone knows the past without influencing it, so too God also knows the future without influencing it. That's the simple standard. That's like any book on this topic in Judaism would have that as the first answer. That is the simple explanation, right? For why that explanation is insufficient and why we need more Hasidic information on that, come back next week.